we'd like to invite the most wonderful Bruce Daisley and Rory Sutherland up to the stage, please, for the next stage. Do you want to introduce Bruce? I'll introduce Rory.
I'll introduce Bruce, no problem at all. Bruce and I worked together 20-odd years ago. I know we both don't look old enough, but we are. And Rory, I'm going to give that to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Bruce, as many of you know, has gone on to author a #1 best-selling book, The Joy of Work. He was a joy to work with, so there's lots of that in the book as well. And also, obviously, the #1 podcast, which has done incredibly well. And I know the most recent 2 episodes in particular are being talked about all the time with the football managers in particular. So the Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat has done incredibly well. Bruce's views are always igniting in people's thoughts, and he's got lots of propositions that we do and don't disagree with. He also says lots of bosses are crap, so I think that kind of ties into what Tamara and Julia touched on as well. So we thought it was only right and proper that Bruce is one of the panel today, just to talk about how we see the future of work. What does it really mean? What's the future of the office? Flexible working, all the stuff that's being talked about right now. So Bruce, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Hello. Google have banned people from hugging people.
Have they?
Yeah. I went somewhere. So
Are you sure it's people, Bruce?
Google have banned bosses from hugging or anyone from hugging each other. And I was chatting to someone about that, and they said, at Oracle, you're not allowed to be Facebook friends with each other as well. So we're sort of trying to gradually depersonalise work and try and prevent people from having any sort of natural human connection.
We need to stop that. Mark Howell's not here this morning. I'll take it up with him.
And I would love to introduce Rory. Rory, as we know, is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy. And because it's such a vague title, it's enabled you to also co-found a behavioural science practice within the agency, which I just think is wonderful. And of course, is exactly the kind of insight we need here. Rory also writes for The Spectator and for Wired. I was actually looking through some of your articles yesterday in The Spectator, and I must say, your Brexit article made me feel very, very safe. It really did. Yeah. It really comforted me. So thank you for that. Most recently, he's been writing The Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense, which I'm very keen to read. And I actually met Rory initially. We were both speaking in Montenegro. And I have to be honest, most of the people were quite simply only there for Rory. He literally held the audience in complete rapture. And I think the one person who perfectly sums up Rory is Tom Goodwin, who, if any of you know him, doesn't hold many people in particularly high regard, but actually refers to Rory as the one person that he loves and that he thinks that you're amazing. So we can all back that up as well.
I didn't know that.
Now you do.
Very nice to know.
Anyway, Kath, do you want to kick off?
Well, I thought we'd start with Bruce, if that's all right, Bruce, because there was something in your book that's come up this morning with both Julia and Dr. Tamara, which is about things under pressure. You've done some research in the book that says that everything from eating to sex is worse under pressure. Given what you've heard this morning, can you say a bit more about that, and what's the antidote?
Yeah, everyone else is sort of trying to promote their books. The one book I think anyone should read this year, I've really been swept away with Lost Connections by Johan Hari. I'm not sure if you've read that. If you haven't read that, then probably watching the TED Talk would be the best illustration of that book. That book really, ostensibly, you might be embarrassed to pick it up because ostensibly it's about depression and societal depression. But more than anything, he talks about how we've created a society where people feel disconnected with each other. He says that if we use the word disconnected rather than depressed, we might actually solve some of these solutions in a slightly more competent way. But one of the things he talks about in his book is that you'll probably have heard some of the stats, that 87% of British workers are disengaged from their job, where they don't feel connected to what they're meant to be doing. They feel like they don't want to do the best version of it. But some of the things that he talks about there are that those things are particularly acute the further down you go down hierarchy. And most of us find ourselves, it's one of those paradoxes that we associate stress with bosses, that bosses having heart attacks, whereas actually it's completely inverted from that. More often than not, stress afflicts people lower down the hierarchy rather than higher up the hierarchy. And anyway, one of the things he talks about is how pressure and stress is the affliction of largely people who don't feel like they've got any control over their job. And I think that's the way we've engineered modern work. We've engineered modern work that most of us feel like we're not in control of the amount of meetings we do. We're not in control of the amount of emails we receive. We're not able to bring any sort of degree of autonomy, any degree of control to the job we're doing. And the natural response of all of that is that we demonstrate what normally in nature would be a submissive pattern of behaviour, which it looks identical to depression. And so we've created this world where none of us are actually given the control and the autonomy to actually get anything done. And it's a pretty miserable state of affairs, I think. But, a lot of us would recognise the average for Britain is that the average British person spends 16 hours a week in meetings. And I suspect most of the people in this room probably at the high end of that. That, we find ourselves just going back to back into meetings where it's this remarkable dissonance, I think. If the child version of you was to observe how many hours of meetings, how many hours a week you spent in meetings, they'd be astonished. But then if they were to see how little attention you were paying in those meetings, they'd be sort of, what on earth's going on? It's like this sort of self-inflicted hostage situation where we go into meetings to pretend to look interested and try and feign interest. We're mortified when someone glances us looking at Instagram because we're trying to at least stimulate some sort of some life into ourselves. And so I think we've just created this existence for a lot of us, which is just deeply dissatisfying.
So what do you think then is the answer to that? I mean, personally, I think that there's two sides to it. I think organisations really have the responsibility of looking at how they change that. And I'm looking at Tom in particular, who, has genuinely changed things over at Lab, looked at not only shortening their weeks down to 4 days, but also then within that, looking at how they operate things like meeting cultures, for example. I think that we also need to get a lot better as humans as well as individuals of not only understanding ourselves but really setting better boundaries in the first place, because then of course we can manage ourselves that bit better. And I've got a really great example. A friend of mine, he's an architect, and he's now said that when he works with clients, he sends a contract to them and he states in that contract he only answers emails between 11 and 12 every single day. Now, when he first sent out the first contract, he absolutely, should we say, bricked himself. And it was actually to someone that he'd marred all his life, Paul Smith, and it was his new client, and he didn't hear back from him for 2 days. And he was petrified. He'd absolutely buggered it up. And actually, he got back a response from Paul saying, this is one of the best contracts that I've ever seen. And I think the point of it being is that as humans, in particular, where space is expanding so much and our capacity is expanding so much, we need better boundaries and to set that with each other.
It's the curse of people who've got high power believing that what they can assert from high power is universally applicable. And it's a total illusion. And unfortunately, what happens is people who have got high status come into situations like this and they tell stories like that. And let me tell you, you go and tell people who've got 5 years career that story, it's completely unapplicable to them. It is of no use whatsoever. Here's one thing. I know Rory knows this Farnham Street blog. There's a really interesting behavioural science blog by a guy, and there's one thing that I'd ask you to read on there, which is the story of a company called Nucor. Nucor is a strange organisation. It's actually one of the most profitable steel manufacturers in the US, and it actually started out as a nuclear power company, which is why its name seems to be a disconnect with what it does. But anyway, Nucor discovered, and don't read the book about it, read the blog post on Farnham Street, The Knowledge Project, the blog is called. They talk about how they reach this realization. They create steel from reused steel. So they say they create these things called mini mills rather than sort of smelting plants. But they realized very quickly that it was an illusion to have a marketing firm that ran across the whole of the US, and it was an illusion to do recruitment that ran across the whole of the US, and it was an illusion to deal with distribution across the whole of the US. So they empowered every mini mill to do all of those things themselves. And so their head office had 30 people. It's remarkable for a big organisation like that. because they realised that actually it was a total illusion, that doing things at scale makes them more efficient. And by doing things small, actually people just felt like they had control, autonomy, they did a much better job. It's this trade-off, scale versus people feeling like they can actually contribute something. And I think that's the curse of modern work. We've created big organisations that then spend, to Julia's point about 150 connections, the sort of Dunbar number. We've created organisations where the burden of trying to stay connected to so many people creates this gravitational pull that if there was any advantage of scale, it's completely wiped out by the fact that everyone feels completely disconnected from their jobs and feels like they have no autonomy. And so that new core thing, that blog post is like 2-page blog post, I think is such an inspiration for thinking about maybe the way that we've done things is wrong. I chatted to this brilliant architect, this guy called Bjarke Ingels, who's sort of regarded in many ways as one of the top 3 or 4 architects in the world. And he was talking about, he's designing the 2 new buildings, the Landscraper at King's Cross, the new Google building, and he's designing Googleplex in Mountain View for them. And I asked him how he thought about actually, I think architecture is fascinating, but most of us find ourselves in open plan offices that are beautifully aesthetic, but a nightmare to work in. So I wanted to know his philosophy when it came to building good, productive workplaces. And he said his inspiration was Building 20 at MIT. And you won't know Building 20, but it's very famous because in a period of about 12 years, it produced 9 Nobel Prize winning physicists. So it was a physics lab at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So everyone started thinking, okay, is there something in the construction of this building that seems to facilitate creativity? Well, if you or I were to look at it now, it looks like a porter cabin. They knocked it down now because it was like a horrible wooden construction, famous for having mice, famous for having leaks. And so they were interested, why was it that structure seemed to facilitate creativity? It's because it was such a mess, people would turn up at a weekend and install a new wall. They'd create a little office for themselves. They'd build something. And the remarkable thing about highly productive environments seems to be that people can self-organise into smaller teams. And I think that's the critical thing. That's the lesson from that new core organisation. Smaller seems to be way more efficient. And the unfortunate thing is we live in a world with scale where we think unless we're big, we can't get anything done. And the thing that we compromise by going big is we compromise the degree of humanity, the degree of a sort of social connection that actually inspires and motivates us.
Rory, we need to hear from you. While I'm finding out you're vaping on stage, which I think is flexible working to the max. Can I just say that?
No, absolutely, no. A large number of our problems are actually collective nicotine withdrawal, if you ask me. Simultaneously and at scale, too dangerous. No, one of the things I would say is I think it's okay to blame tech, and I think it's vitally important that we do interrogate tech very heavily. And part of the reason for this is it suddenly occurs to me that I'm now in a vanishingly small percentage of the working population who remember life before tech, where 98% of work required that you be in a specific place. And it's worth remembering that Silicon Valley is a highly ideological project which has certain unshakable beliefs in efficiency and scale, and in particular in the removal of constraints. Okay, so I was in, I think it was Mountain View, in fact, and when you're in Mountain View, you actually see these tiny little miniature petrol tankers, gas tankers as they call them, driving around. And they're sort of about a quarter the size or a fifth the size of a normal gas tanker. So I said to my host, what the hell are those? He said, oh, it's a new service, it's Uber for gasoline, so while you're coding at work, these gas tankers turn up, you leave your petrol tank flap open, and they refuel your car for you. Okay? And I have to say, I think that's batshit crazy, okay? First of all, in the real world, you never really stop at a petrol station and only buy petrol, do you? You know, you buy 2 pints of milk which you've forgotten and a cheeky M&S pork pie because your wife's not there to stop you. You know, there's always a multiple function. But also there's a value to those little interruptions, and there's a value to those constraints. And what you've got to remember is that in 1988, the room you're in, the place you're in, determined what you did. Okay? When you were in the photocopier room, you photocopied. When you were in a meeting room, you met. Okay? And that's pretty much, those constraints were healthy because they did 2 things. They provided focus, By the way, if you're in a meeting, the mere presence of a mobile phone or a beep from a mobile phone reduces your concentration even if you don't look at it. The mere knowledge that something else is going on somewhere else actually significantly reduces your ability to concentrate. Secondly, there's the point about time, which is that 10 blocks of 1 hour aren't the same as 1 block of 10 hours. For that, I'd read a paper by Y Combinator's Paul Graham, which is called Maker Schedule versus Manager Schedule. Managers of organizations tend to think productivity is akin to cramming in as much shit as you possibly can in any given day. Anybody who's genuinely making something, what they need is large periods of uninterrupted time devoted to one thing only. This is why if you have a creative person and you put a half-hour meeting in the middle of their afternoon, they go batshit insane, because to you it's only half an hour, to them that's the whole afternoon ruined. Okay. So productivity is not actually what you might call fungible. Different units of time aren't actually exchangeable. But there's also a fundamental Silicon Valley assumption, and actually you see it in the book Microsurfs, where he said, you know, the whole purpose of technology is to make geography irrelevant. It's to enable you to do anything at any time in any place. And the underlying assumption, which is, again, very, very common, rather like the assumption that scale is automatically good, okay, these massive mental frames underpin huge amounts of business decision-making, and because they seem logical, they're very rarely questioned. What you've got to remember is that in any sort of board setting, okay, anything that's consistent with the theory of mainstream neoliberal economics has a very low burden of proof attached to it. You know, if you say the product's not selling, so we're going to drop the price, that's the kind of decision that's approved in about 17 seconds, because it's consistent with the overriding theory and mental frame that everybody adopts. If you said we're going to put the price up and do an advertising campaign featuring an animated dancing duck, okay, that will require about 6 months to justify, because it's counterintuitive. And so business decision-making has been massively in the grip of these biases, where scale equates with efficiency and the removal of constraints is automatically a good thing. Now, what it probably is the application of mechanistic thinking to human behavior, which isn't appropriate in lots and lots of different ways. You know, the modeling of any organization as though it were a machine is a really, really dangerous mental model to adopt in the first place. But actually, constraints are good. And if you look at every civilized society, they actually artificially create constraints. The Sabbath, okay, which is something that practically every religion has created. I think you have a techno Sabbath, is that right, Julia? Which is it, Friday, Saturday, Sunday?
It's Friday.
Friday.
Yeah.
Do you do it sundown, or is it...
But I'm actually now calling for a Saturn Saturday, because Saturn.
God of Peace? Is it, or Serenity?
Hexagons, but Saturday is the day.
But constraints are actually a good thing, because they actually drive focus and they help you partition your life. They also help solve the coordination problem, which is it's much better for everybody to take a day off on the same day for social purposes than for everybody to take a different day off. So they solve two problems. They solve the partitioning problem and the coordination problem. And that, I think, is something, if we want to actually benefit from technology rather than allowing technology to rule us, one of the things we've got to increasingly look at is, and I've just written a piece for Wired about this, the partitioning of the working week. So whatever percentage of your working week has to be done in the office, okay, it's now less than 80%. I think it's fair to say, okay? Less than 80% of your work is both place-dependent and time-dependent. Now, that doesn't benefit us at all if everybody's effectively doing different things at a different time. If, however, you drive everything that's non-location specific towards a Monday or a Friday, say, or a Wednesday and a Friday, and everything that's location specific towards 3 remaining days, you create a spectacular amount of additional freedom just in terms of the work that people can do, the fact that different blocks of time are devoted to different activities, because as Julia pointed out, we lose a certain number of minutes every time we flip from one thing to another. So that partitioning effort would be hugely valuable, not only in terms of work-life balance, but simply in our ability to perform work. You know, video conferencing, by the way, I think is important. I've talked to Zoom, and I said, the great mistake you guys made is you positioned yourself as the shit, cheap alternative to air travel. The way you should sell yourself is as the vastly superior alternative to email. Okay, you picked the wrong enemy, in a sense. But I think there's something there where if we actually look at intelligent partitioning of the working week, where different days are actually dedicated to different forms of interaction. One thing that drives me absolutely insane is that essentially when I'm in the office, okay, the only reason to be in an office in 2019 is to talk to people. Every moment I spend talking to people effectively brings me, every hour I spend doing that, effectively brings me an hour of unpaid overtime in dealing with the emails that are coming in during that period. You know, it's not a great trade-off. Now, the other thing that drives me crazy is people who come into the office at the busiest time of day on the tube and then spend 2.5 hours doing their email on a screen which would look no different anywhere else on the planet. So if we can learn to divide our time better and actually to say that constraints can be good and that actually every time technology comes along, it will remove constraints and actually our job is to replace some of them, even if it requires a kind of artificial rule-based setting, I think we've got to learn to do that. Because Silicon Valley's view is that if you give everybody freedom to do everything at any time, in any place, that some sort of optimal thing will emerge. It doesn't.
Rory, can I just ask you and Bruce then, in that case, what does not always being on or partitioning, as you're saying, what does it cost you as leaders and what does it afford you in reality? What have you experienced in practicing in this way?
It doesn't cost me anything. By the way, I mean, I always use this phrase, I need flexible working, not just for mental health and work-life balance. I need flexible working to do my work. Just in case you think this is really new, David Ogilvy never wrote a single thing in the office, okay? All his ads, all his body copy, all his books, all written at home. Couldn't work in the office, too many distractions. He understood, essentially, make a schedule, manage a schedule, and he realized when I'm in the office, I talk to people, I manage them, I do lots of things in series. When I go home, I focus on one thing and one thing only. And I don't think this is anything new, the fact that different people require different settings in which to do different kinds of work. It used to be something we didn't notice because it was an automatic product of our environment. We now need to actually recreate it.
But he was a boss, right? So to Bruce's point,
fair point,
if you're not the boss, how can someone get a more David Ogilvy style of working if you are 5 years in, let's say, at Twitter?
Yeah, I mean,
For example.
for me, is that even on? Is that on? For me, it's all about trying to create norms where the low status people can back out of things. I think one of the most pernicious things that definitely happens in a lot of Silicon Valley firms is weekend emails. And we used to have a situation at Twitter where Twitter has ups and downs, and the consequence of that was that we burnt through people very quickly. And we had this situation where about 4 years ago, the reason why I became so fascinated with workplace culture was trying to fix what had gone wrong at my organisation. And about 4 years ago, we saw about 40% turnover across the company really, but 40% in London. And we were presented with this thing where people were resigning with no job to go to. And it forces you to ask big questions. You know, if we've got one of those jobs that's meant to be an aspirational, desirable place to work and people are leaving with no job to go to, there's obviously some big disconnect between the experience of the job from the people who are doing it and the promise of the job that we're projecting to the outside world. And we started looking at it, and a lot of it was down to norms that we'd allowed to creep in. So weekend emails were incredibly common. And the consequence of that is that people feel like there's no escape, that work's following them round. Like you go and look at something on the internet and then those ads follow you everywhere. But it's like that, but in your job. And so people were finding that they just couldn't escape work. People were asking you to just quickly fill in something, just quickly, can you just give me a quick answer on this by end of play Sunday? And it's just, those norms create a exhaustion in people that ultimately workers are presented with the choice, do I stick around for this or do I leave?
But by the way, I mean, another Silicon Valley assumption, and there are lots of them, and they're kind of axiomatic, is that instant is better than delayed. I would like 99% of my emails to take 2 hours before they're sent, okay? Or to have, by default, a deferred sending at the weekend. There's a famous case of a boss who was very keen on fell walking. And so his approach to the weekend was to get up early on Saturday morning, fire off a load of emails, and then spend the rest of the weekend in stout footwear, marching around on hills. And it was 2 years later where all his underlings, in other words, the rest of the board, pointed out to him, you realise that when you do that, you ruin our entire weekend. Now, he was doing it merely so he could spend the weekend fell walking. He wasn't really intending the emails to arrive or be read until Monday morning. But, I mean, by the way, the greatest tech shame is that email hasn't improved, that no useful functionality has been added to it.
They're just starting to add that scheduled send, the ability to delay sending.
But by default, if you send an email on Saturday, it shouldn't arrive until, sometime on Monday at random. No, seriously. That should emphatically be the default. And the fact that it's instantaneous is an assumption, okay? If you think about it, batch processing, the single greatest thing you can do to improve, apparently, your workplace productivity is to massively reduce the frequency with which you check your email server. So actually the Victorians, where the postman arrived 4 times a day, kind of had it right. You devote 4 chunks of your day to dealing with this crap, and then you get on with the rest of it. You spend writing, The Origin of Species or something. That was, the Victorians had it much better. Yeah.
Can I just ask the audience, how many of you have your notifications switched off, as in on a regular basis? So quite a good amount of you, because I personally have found that's made a huge difference when I'm away or flying or something, that I don't actually get that constant nagging reminder. So that's worked for you, Bruce, isn't it, for certain?
Yeah. Can I ask both of you a question? You are both obviously brilliant bosses, and I think you touched on this, Bruce, about the fact that someone who's got 5 years' experience obviously doesn't have quite as much control as someone who is a boss themselves. As bosses, what do you think is the one thing, I appreciate it's a very big question, but one thing that we can be doing differently to be better leaders in order to get the best of our people now?
For me, I saw Elon Musk talking just a few months ago, and he said the secret of success is working 120 hours a week. And he said, unless you're working 80, you're pretty much not showing up. And it's the opposite of that. So it's just, the really interesting thing is that if you look into how there's been some brilliant neuroscience today, but brains are far more finite than we give them credit. And the science of this is something called ego depletion, which is a confusing name. But the principle of ego depletion is reflected in that moment when you get home and maybe your partner or someone in the house with you asks you a question, you're like, sorry, I need a minute, I can't think. Because our brains are far more finite, they're far more zero-sum than we give it credit. And the more that we recognise that in the way that we work, the better. So all I've tried to do at my workplace is sort of model that 40 hours a week is enough work, and that people should never feel ashamed of stepping away from their desk because they feel like they can't get things done. And if you try and model that, it tends to at least create the context for people to have discussions on it.
I think there's a huge problem where people aren't really sure what they're achieving because the modern work world is highly complex. It's not like being a carpenter. If you look at people who actually produce manufactured goods, they don't work massive hours because they're fairly confident in the value of what they produce because they can see it. When you don't know the value of what you produce, your natural default is just to do whatever feels like hard work. And we're not very good at judging, by the way, the difference between what's difficult and what's productive. Because if it feels difficult, we think it's productive. Now, I'll give you a classic example of this, which I had to explain to the video conferencing industry. I said, do you realise that if you think about it, when you go on a boat at 35 miles an hour, you kind of go, wee, this is really fast, isn't it? It's exciting, okay? Now, if you go in a car at 35 miles an hour, you don't do that. Right? You don't go, wow, what a white knuckle, unless you're a Labrador and you stick your head out of the window. You don't generally go, what a white knuckle experience. Suddenly occurred to me, none of us realise how unbelievably fucking slow typing is compared to speaking. Okay, if Bruce and I had delivered this talk at typing speed, someone would have come and punched us in the face. Right, okay. Hello, it's really, oh God, I've mistyped. Really good to be here today, right? Okay, if this whole morning had progressed at that speed, we would have regarded it as intolerably awful. Okay, but while we're typing fast as far as typing goes, so we go, shit, I'm being really productive here, I'm typing really quite a lot. But actually, compared to what you could have achieved in a corresponding conversation, it's dismal, and it's totally asynchronous. So then the other person doesn't reply for a day and a half, and so what could have been sorted in a 10-minute chat effectively gets protracted over 25 minutes spread over 3 days. And yet, because we're basically using the busyness heuristic, we don't realise how shit this is.
I 100% agree with you, by the way, Rory. I think that's absolutely true. We should ban all emails completely. But just talking a bit before we finish about the future of the office, and clearly flex working is coming up over and over again. I know that Channel 4 are about to introduce a working at home day for everybody, but their anxiety is it'll be like the Marie Celeste on a Friday because no one's going to be there. So then it's about trust, and that comes back to psychological safety. There's been businesses that don't have any offices, but people have found their guilt has meant that they've ended up working far more hours because they're anxious to prove that they're working. What's the answer here from both of you for the future of the actual physical office?
Yeah, to Rory's point before, you see a really strong correlation between organisations that... organisations, generally what happens is it's driven by cost. So organisations find themselves moving to hot desks, and then they switch to working from home because it reduces the desk occupancy and it looks better on the bottom line. And what you almost always observe in those organisations is gradually the disconnection between individuals grows. And what you find is that each time, when people are working on a project together, generally in a week, they chat to each other face to face about 40 times in a week. When they work remotely located, they chat to each other about 8 times. And if you presume that each one of those conversations is in service of the work being better, more coordinated, you're sort of refining it, then you lose a big element of that work being done together by people being remotely located, and it feels disconnected.
You can recapture that by saying, okay, when you're in the office, you don't look at a screen except for 2 hours a day. So your office time is maximising face-to-face opportunity, your home time. My ultimate dream, and I have to set an example here, is to create an office of twats. I don't know if you know the acronym. It stands for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, just in case you wondered. Okay. Where essentially the middle of the week, or at least three and a half days of the week, are devoted to face-to-face contact. And then the other 2 are devoted to the stuff which doesn't require other people's presence or any particular physical location. And it's also, by the way, increasing, so much of our work is actually in a different time zone that I've begun to have this debate, which is, to be honest, time you're prepared to spend at 7 o'clock in the evening at home is more valuable than time you're prepared to spend at midday on Friday. So we have to ultimately, in another 3 years, have a debate about what the working week looks like in its entirety as well.
Amazing. Thank you. I thought that was pretty awesome, actually. Thank you, guys. That was incredible.